The autumn rain fell in sheets across Pinewood Valley as Officer Ethan Mason patrolled the mountain roads with Shadow, his German Shepherd partner who'd finally begun to trust him after months of patient training. During a warehouse raid targeting the notorious Blackwood drug cartel, gunshots echoed through the night, and Ethan crumpled to the ground as Shadow lunged desperately at the attackers, his bark transforming into a mournful howl. 3 months later, on a gray November morning, mourners gathered at Pinewood Cemetery, where dress uniforms darkened with rain and somber faces turned toward a flag-draped coffin, when Shadow began frantically barking at his handler's casket, refusing to be silenced despite the efforts of 4 officers. The police chief reluctantly ordered it opened, revealing a face that made Ethan's mother scream in horror, her voice cutting through the downpour. "That's not my son." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Pinewood Valley sat nestled between the ancient mountains of western Pennsylvania, a town of 12,000 souls where logging trucks still rumbled through Main Street and everyone knew which families had been there since the railroad came through in 1891. The mountains that made the valley so beautiful also made it perfect for another industry: drug trafficking. Remote roads, sparse law enforcement, and proximity to 3 state borders created an ideal corridor for the Blackwood cartel. Ethan Mason had returned to civilian life 3 years ago, after 12 years in the Army's Military Police K-9 Division. At 35, his face carried the weathered lines of a man who'd seen too much Afghanistan, Iraq, and the funeral of his wife and 6-year-old daughter, victims of a house fire while he was deployed. He'd come to Pinewood Valley seeking anonymity and quiet, only to find himself recruited by Chief Margaret Sullivan for the department's struggling K-9 unit. Shadow wasn't supposed to be Ethan's dog. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had been through 3 handlers in 8 months, each ending with the same report: aggressive, uncooperative, unsuitable for police work. The sleek black dog with intelligent amber eyes had come from a military background too. Though the details were classified, all Ethan knew was that Shadow's previous handler had died in combat, and the dog had been deemed difficult to rehabilitate ever since. Chief Sullivan, a no-nonsense woman of 58 with steel-gray hair and a reputation for fairness, had given Ethan an ultimatum: make it work with Shadow, or the dog would be removed from the program permanently. "He's your last chance, and you're his," she'd told him bluntly. Ryan Mitchell had joined the department 6 months ago, a 28-year-old rookie with an eagerness that Ethan found both refreshing and suspicious. The younger officer had specifically requested assignment with Ethan's K-9 unit, claiming admiration for Ethan's military record. Sarah Mason, Ethan's mother, had moved to Pinewood after her son joined the force. At 65, she still carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of a military wife, though grief had softened her once sharp edges. She'd never fully recovered from losing her granddaughter, and Ethan was all she had left. Pastor James Wilson, who'd served as the town's spiritual leader for 4 decades, had been instrumental in securing funding for the K-9 program. The elderly man knew everyone's secrets and sorrows, carrying them with a compassion that had earned him the town's enduring respect. The first time Ethan met Shadow, the German Shepherd had lunged at him, teeth bared, stopping only at the end of his leash held by a nervous handler from the county animal control. "He's gone through 3 officers already," Chief Sullivan had explained, standing safely beyond the chain-link fence of the training yard. "Military background, like you. Something happened overseas that's not in his file. Nobody can reach him." Ethan had simply nodded, studying the dog's posture, the tension in his haunches, the way his ears flattened against his skull. The intelligence behind those amber eyes that said this wasn't aggression. It was fear. "Leave us alone," Ethan had said quietly, not taking his eyes off Shadow. "Mason, department policy. Give me an hour. Chief, just me and him." Sullivan had hesitated before finally nodding. "1 hour. Don't make me call an ambulance." When everyone had gone, Ethan did something that made the training officer later call him either the bravest or stupidest K-9 handler I've ever seen. He sat down cross-legged on the ground, back against the fence, and closed his eyes. For 45 minutes, he didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed slowly, deliberately, the way he'd learned to do when the memories of gunfire and screams threatened to overwhelm him in the middle of the night. Eventually, he felt rather than heard Shadow approach, the dog's breath warm against his hand. Ethan didn't move, didn't open his eyes. "I know what it's like," he whispered finally, "to survive when others didn't, to not know how to live with that." For weeks after that first meeting, progress came in microscopic increments. Shadow would follow basic commands but maintained a rigid distance, physical and otherwise. He performed his duties impeccably, but returned each night to the kennel at the station, refusing Ethan's invitations to the small cabin he called home. December brought the first heavy snowfall of the season, and with it, the disappearance of 8-year-old Katie Anderson. The girl had wandered away from her family's Christmas tree farm on the mountain's western slope, just as a blizzard descended on Pinewood Valley. By the time Ethan and Shadow arrived at the search staging area, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and visibility was down to 20 feet. Search and rescue teams had been combing the area for 3 hours with no success. "We'll lose her to exposure if we don't find her soon," the fire chief said grimly, handing Ethan one of Katie's mittens. Ethan knelt beside Shadow. "Find," he commanded, holding the mitten to the dog's nose. Shadow took the scent, then did something unexpected. Instead of heading into the forest where the search teams had been focusing, he turned and raced toward the service road that wound around the back of the mountain, an area everyone had dismissed because it led away from the tree farm. "Shadow!" "Wait!" Ethan called, breaking into a run as the dog disappeared into the swirling snow. For nearly a mile, Ethan followed blindly, trusting Shadow's instincts more than his own judgment. The service road narrowed, then ended abruptly at a maintenance shed for the county water district. Inside, huddled beneath a tarp, lay Katie Anderson, lips blue with cold but alive. She'd gotten turned around in the woods and followed what she thought was a path home, only to find the shed and take shelter. As paramedics worked to warm the child, Ethan found Shadow standing apart from the commotion, watching intently. For the first time, Ethan saw something beyond duty in the dog's posture, something like satisfaction. That night, when Ethan opened the door to his truck, Shadow hesitated only briefly before jumping into the passenger seat, and for the first time since being paired together, the German Shepherd followed Ethan into his cabin, circled the rug by the wood stove 3 times, and lay down as if he'd always belonged there. Word spread quickly about Shadow and Katie Anderson. Suddenly, the problem dog became Pinewood Valley's hero. Chief Sullivan made their partnership permanent, and over the next year, Ethan and Shadow became the department's most effective team, particularly in narcotics detection. Shadow's extraordinary sense of smell led to 17 drug busts in 11 months, including 3 major shipments linked to the Blackwood cartel. The dog could detect substances hidden in secret compartments that experienced human officers would have missed. With each success, the bond between handler and dog deepened, their communication becoming almost telepathic. Thomas Blackwood noticed. The drug kingpin had operated with near impunity in 3 counties for almost a decade, insulated from prosecution by money, fear, and strategic friendships with the right officials. But Ethan and Shadow represented a new threat, one that couldn't be bribed or intimidated through conventional means. The first warning came on a Tuesday in July. Ethan returned from a court appearance to find his truck's windshield smashed, a note tucked beneath the wiper blade. Dogs die first, then handlers. Chief Sullivan wanted to pull them off active duty. "This isn't a game. Mason," she'd argued in her office, while Shadow lay watchfully at Ethan's feet. "Blackwood doesn't make threats. He makes promises. If we back down, he wins," Ethan had countered. "Shadow and I are close to something big. I can feel it." 3 days later, they made the bust that should have ended Blackwood's operation, a warehouse containing enough fentanyl to kill half the state, along with documentation linking the drugs directly to Blackwood's shell companies. It should have been a career-defining triumph. Instead, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. The raid was scheduled for October 12th, a cold, clear night with a full moon. Clear. Ethan and Ryan Mitchell were assigned surveillance, with backup positioned 2 minutes away. Shadow, unusually restless that evening, kept whining from his compartment in the patrol vehicle. "Something's wrong," Ethan murmured, watching the warehouse through binoculars. "Shadow feels it." Ryan checked his weapon for the 3rd time. "Backup's close. We got this." When 3 men emerged from the warehouse's side door carrying duffel bags, Ethan made the call. "Suspects exiting east side with possible contraband. Moving to intercept." They approached with textbook precision. But everything went wrong in an instant. Gunfire erupted from somewhere to their right, a position that should have been empty according to their intelligence. Ethan felt the impact before he heard the shot. A sledgehammer blow to his chest that knocked him backward. As he fell, he heard Shadow's frantic barking from the locked patrol car, saw Ryan return fire, then drop beside him. His last conscious thought was of Shadow, launching himself against the vehicle's window, desperate to reach him as darkness closed in. Sarah Mason was washing dishes when the phone rang at 11:42 p.m. Later, she would remember the exact time, the warm water on her hands, the rerun of an old sitcom playing on the small kitchen television. She would remember these ordinary details because they belonged to the last moments of her old life, before everything shattered. Mrs. Mason. The voice belonged to a woman trying to sound professional despite obvious strain. "This is Pinewood Valley Memorial Hospital. There's been an incident involving your son, Officer Mason." The drive to the hospital took 12 minutes that stretched like years. Chief Sullivan met her in the emergency room, uniform rumpled, eyes red-rimmed. The words came in fragments that Sarah's mind struggled to assemble: ambush, multiple gunshot wounds, operating room, critical condition. "His face," Chief Sullivan said softly. "The damage is extensive. They're doing everything they can." Dawn broke over the mountains as a surgeon finally emerged, still wearing blood-stained scrubs. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mason. We did everything possible, but the injuries were too severe." The clinical details washed over her massive trauma. Blood loss, organ failure while her world contracted to a single, unbearable fact she had outlived her son. "Would you like to see him?" the surgeon asked gently. Sarah found herself shaking her head. "Not yet," she whispered. How could she look at Ethan's face and say goodbye when she'd just spoken to him yesterday, when he'd promised to come for Sunday dinner? The hospital staff explained that facial injuries made visual identification difficult. "Standard procedure in these cases," the administrator said, pushing forms across a desk. "We can confirm identity through dental records and fingerprints." Sarah signed where indicated, moving through these formalities like a sleepwalker. At the police station, Shadow's behavior changed immediately. The dog, who had always maintained a professional demeanor, even aloof at times, became frantic when Ethan didn't return. He refused food, water, even rest, pacing the halls and howling through the night. "I've never seen anything like it," Officer Ramirez told Chief Sullivan 3 days after the shooting. "He won't leave Ethan's locker, growls at anyone who approaches." Sullivan watched the German Shepherd through her office window, noting how the animal's powerful frame had already begun to show signs of weight loss. "The vet says he's grieving," she said quietly. "Might not pull through if this continues." Against department protocol, but following her instincts, Sullivan arranged for Shadow to attend Ethan's funeral. "The dog deserves closure, too," she told the skeptical department chaplain. "Maybe seeing the casket will help him understand." The morning of the funeral dawned gray and wet, as if the mountains themselves were in mourning. Uniformed officers from 3 counties stood at attention as the hearse arrived at Pinewood Cemetery. Sarah Mason sat beneath a black umbrella, supported by Pastor Wilson on one side and her sister from Ohio on the other. Officer Ramirez led Shadow on a short leash, the dog unusually subdued as the service began. The German Shepherd watched the proceedings with an intensity that several mourners later described as unnerving, his amber eyes never leaving the flag-draped casket. Pastor Wilson spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of a life given in service to community. He mentioned Ethan's military career, his work with the K-9 unit, the lives he and Shadow had saved together. Throughout it all, Shadow remained still, alert but controlled. It was only when the honor guard moved to transfer the casket from the hearse to the gravesite that something changed. Shadow's posture shifted, his ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. "Easy, boy," Ramirez murmured, tightening his grip on the leash. The first bark startled everyone sharp, urgent, commanding attention. Shadow lunged forward with such force that Ramirez, caught unprepared, lost his footing on the wet grass. The dog broke free, racing toward the pallbearers with single-minded determination. "Stop him!" someone shouted. But Shadow was already circling the casket, barking frantically, pawing at the polished wood. 3 officers moved to intercept him, but the dog evaded them with the agility that had made him so effective in the field. Each time someone approached, Shadow would retreat, only to return to the casket with renewed urgency. "What's wrong with that animal?" demanded Judge Henderson, who had come to pay respects to the officer whose testimony had secured multiple convictions. Chief Sullivan approached slowly, crouching to Shadow's eye level. "Shadow," she said firmly. "Enough." To everyone's surprise, the dog fell silent, fixing the chief with an intent stare before turning back to the casket and emitting a single, plaintive whine. For 20 uncomfortable minutes, the standoff continued. Shadow refused to leave the casket, growling whenever the pallbearers attempted to resume their duties. The rain intensified, soaking through dress uniforms and dampening the resolve of even the most patient mourners. "Could the dog be sensing something?" Pastor Wilson finally asked, voicing the question that had begun to circulate in whispers. The elderly minister approached Chief Sullivan, speaking quietly. "In my years, I've seen animals know things we don't. Maybe." "What are you suggesting?" Sullivan asked, though something in her expression suggested she'd begun wondering the same thing. "Let the dog see him." Pastor Wilson said simply, "Open the casket. Let Shadow see Officer Mason and say goodbye. It might be the only way to calm him." A murmur ran through the gathered mourners. Opening a casket outdoors, in these conditions, went against every protocol and tradition. "Absolutely not," the funeral director protested. "The family has specifically requested a closed casket service due to the nature of the injuries." Sarah Mason, who had remained silent throughout the disruption, suddenly rose from her seat. "Do it," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Open it." "Mrs. Mason," the funeral director began, "given the condition—" "My son loved that dog," Sarah interrupted. "And that dog loved my son. If Shadow needs to see him, then open it." With reluctant professionalism, the funeral staff removed the flag and raised the casket lid. Shadow immediately fell silent. Approaching with newfound calmness, he sniffed once, twice, then backed away with a growl that raised the hair on every witness's neck. Sarah stepped forward, peered into the casket, and the scream that tore from her throat would haunt everyone present for years to come. "That's not Ethan. That's not my son." Chaos erupted. Chief Sullivan rushed forward, one hand on her weapon, the other signaling officers to secure the area. Inside the casket lay a man of approximately Ethan's build and coloring, but unmistakably not him. The face, though damaged, belonged to someone else entirely. "Lock down this cemetery," Sullivan barked into her radio. "Nobody leaves. And get me the hospital administrator and the medical examiner here immediately." Shadow, mission apparently accomplished, sat calmly beside the open casket, watching the humans scramble with what several officers later swore was satisfaction. Within an hour, the cemetery had been transformed into a crime scene. As crime scene technicians photographed the casket and its occupant, Shadow suddenly stood, ears alert, and began walking purposefully toward the cemetery gates. "Chief," Officer Ramirez called. "He's trying to tell us something else." Sullivan hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Follow him," she ordered. "Wherever he goes, whatever he's found, I want to know." Sarah Mason, still reeling from shock, watched as Shadow led a small procession of police vehicles away from her son's interrupted funeral. For the first time since receiving that midnight phone call, she felt something stir within her chest, not hope, exactly, but its distant cousin possibility. "If that's not Ethan," she whispered to Pastor Wilson, "then where is my son?" Shadow led the procession of police vehicles through Pinewood Valley with single-minded determination, occasionally pausing at intersections as if confirming his bearings before continuing. The German Shepherd sat in the front seat of Chief Sullivan's SUV, ignoring protocols that would normally have confined him to a kennel compartment. No one dared suggest moving him. "He's heading toward the hospital," Officer Ramirez observed as they turned onto County Route 16, the two-lane highway that connected the cemetery to Pinewood Valley Memorial. Behind them, 3 patrol cars followed. lights flashing but sirens silent. In the rear seat, Sarah Mason sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of composed anguish. 20 years on the force, Sullivan said quietly, and I've never seen anything like this. At the hospital entrance, Shadow leaped from the vehicle before Sullivan could fully stop, racing toward the automatic doors with purpose. Security staff, recognizing the K-9 officer, made no move to intervene as the dog paced anxiously at the threshold, waiting for the humans to catch up. No animals in the hospital, a young administrator began, only to be silenced by Sullivan's raised badge. Police investigation, she said flatly. The dog comes with us. Shadow led them through the lobby, past startled visitors and staff, to the elevator banks. He sat before the doors, looking up expectantly. "Which floor?" Sullivan asked, as if the dog might answer. Sarah Mason, who had been silent since leaving the cemetery, suddenly spoke. "Intensive care, 3rd floor. That's where they told me where Ethan was." Inside the elevator, Shadow pressed against Sarah's legs, the first time the normally reserved dog had initiated contact with her. She found herself resting her hand on his solid back, drawing strength from his certainty. The ICU reception desk was staffed by a nurse who recognized Chief Sullivan from community functions. "Chief, what's going on? And you can't have a dog in the ICU." "I need to see all your John Does and unidentified patients," Sullivan interrupted. Immediately, the nurse's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "We don't have any unidentified patients currently." "Everyone's been," Shadow growled, low and insistent, then moved past the desk toward the patient rooms, nose raised as if tracking a scent. "Stop that dog," the nurse called. But no one moved to intercept Shadow as he proceeded methodically past each room, pausing briefly at each doorway before continuing. At the 6th room, he stopped, body rigid with attention. A soft whine escaped him as he pawed gently at the closed door. Sullivan approached cautiously, peering through the small window. Inside lay a heavily bandaged man, face obscured by gauze, surrounded by monitoring equipment. A chart hung at the foot of the bed, visible through the window. Mitchell. Ryan. "That's Mitchell's room," Sullivan said, turning to the nurse who had followed them. "Ethan's partner from the raid. He survived but hasn't regained consciousness." Shadow whined again, more insistently, scratching at the door. "Chief," Ramirez said quietly, "Shadow was partners with Mason, not Mitchell." "He wouldn't be this interested in Mitchell." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "Get me Dr. Cooper and anyone else involved in identifying the bodies that night. Now." She turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mason, I need your permission to collect DNA from you for comparison testing." Sarah's eyes never left the window to the hospital room. "You think that's Ethan in there, that they mixed up the officers?" "I think," Sullivan said carefully, "that Shadow's trying to tell us something important, and we need to verify it scientifically." Within an hour, the ICU waiting room had been transformed into an impromptu investigation center. Dr. Lillian Cooper, the hospital administrator, arrived looking harried, her lab coat wrinkled as if she'd been wearing it for days. "Chief Sullivan, I understand there's been a concern raised about patient identification." Sullivan gestured toward the room where Shadow had now been permitted to enter, the dog lying protectively beside the bed of the comatose officer. That man was identified as Officer Ryan Mitchell. The officer we buried today was supposedly Ethan Mason. Shadow is telling us otherwise. Dr. Cooper's professional composure faltered. With respect, Chief, you're basing this on a dog's behavior. Both officers were severely injured. Officer Mason died of his injuries. Officer Mitchell survived, but suffered significant trauma. These facts are documented in our records. And how exactly was Officer Mason identified? Sullivan pressed. Given the facial injuries, who made the ID? Cooper hesitated. We followed standard protocol. The personal effects were cataloged when they arrived in the ER. Badges? Wallets? Identification? And who physically checked those IDs against the patients? It would have been the ER charge nurse, but that night was chaos. Chief, we had the warehouse injuries, a multi-vehicle accident on Route 16, and a kitchen fire at the nursing home. We were operating at triple capacity with half staffing. Sullivan's expression hardened. So it's possible that in the chaos, personal effects were switched or misattributed. Theoretically, yes, but I want DNA testing done immediately. Sullivan interrupted. Compare the patient in that room to Mrs. Mason, and I want the body from the funeral examined before it's released for burial. While they waited for the hospital to arrange the testing, Sullivan sent Ramirez back to the station to gather all files related to the warehouse raid. And get me everything we have on both Mason and Mitchell personnel files, next of kin information. Everything. Shadow refused to leave the hospital room, maintaining his vigil beside the bed with a dedication that moved even the most skeptical staff members. A young nurse brought him water and treats, which he accepted without taking his eyes off the patient. He's been like this before, Sarah told Sullivan as they watched through the window. When Ethan's nightmares were at their worst after he came back from overseas, Shadow would lie just like that. Not sleeping, just guarding him through the dark. Sarah's phone rang her sister, still at the cemetery. Wondering what was happening, as Sarah stepped away to explain the unbelievable situation, Sullivan entered the hospital room alone. The rhythmic beeping of monitors provided a sterile soundtrack as she approached the bed. The patient's face remained largely hidden behind bandages, with only his closed eyes and part of his mouth visible. Sullivan studied what she could see, trying to determine if this was Ethan Mason or Ryan Mitchell. "What happened out there?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer from either the comatose patient or the watchful dog. "What did you stumble into?" Shadow raised his head at her voice but remained positioned against the bed, his body a protective barrier between the chief and his handler, if this was indeed Ethan. Sullivan's phone vibrated with a text from Ramirez. "Files pulled. Found something weird. Mitchell's emergency contact info changed 2 weeks before the raid. Need to talk ASAP." Bye. As she turned to leave, Sullivan noticed something she'd overlooked: a small notebook on the bedside table, apparently left by the nursing staff to record vitals and medications, but a corner of paper protruded from between its pages, something that didn't belong. Sullivan carefully extracted it, a pharmacy receipt, dated 3 days before the warehouse raid, for a prescription in Ethan's name. The door opened behind her. "Finding something interesting, Chief, Doctor." Cooper stood in the doorway, her earlier flustered demeanor replaced with a controlled calm that immediately put Sullivan on alert. "Just wondering why Officer Mason's prescription would be in Officer Mitchell's room," Sullivan replied, holding up the receipt. Cooper's expression didn't change. The officers worked closely together. Perhaps Mitchell picked up a prescription for his partner. Not unusual. Perhaps Sullivan conceded, tucking the receipt into her pocket. "How long until we have the DNA results?" 24 to 48 hours for preliminary results." "But, Chief," Cooper hesitated, "you understand the implications if you're right. It would mean a catastrophic failure of hospital protocols. The liability alone. I'm more concerned with finding the truth than protecting the hospital's liability," Sullivan cut in. "A good officer may have been declared dead through negligence or—" She paused meaningfully. "Something more deliberate." Cooper's face paled. "You can't possibly think—" "I don't know what to think yet," Sullivan interrupted. "But Ethan and Shadow had made powerful enemies. The timing of this mistake seems awfully convenient for certain parties." After Cooper left, Sullivan rejoined Sarah in the waiting room, where Ramirez had arrived with the requested files. The young officer looked troubled as he spread folders across a small table. "Ryan Mitchell transferred to Pinewood Valley PD 8 months ago from Philadelphia," Ramirez began. "Exemplary record, specialized in narcotics, specifically requested assignment to our K-9 unit. Nothing unusual there," Sullivan observed. "Except this," Ramirez continued, pulling out a form. 2 weeks before the warehouse raid, Mitchell changed his emergency contact information. Previously, it was his brother in Philadelphia. He changed it to a lawyer named James Hargrove. Sullivan frowned. "Hargrove. Why is that name familiar?" "Because he's also the attorney of record for Thomas Blackwood in 3 separate cases," Ramirez said quietly. Sarah gasped softly. "Are you suggesting Officer Mitchell was working with Blackwood, that he betrayed Ethan?" "It's a connection we can't ignore," Sullivan admitted. "But it still doesn't explain the identity switch at the hospital." A gentle knock interrupted them. Pastor Wilson stood in the doorway, his aging face lined with concern. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on Mrs. Mason, and—" He hesitated. "There's something you should know." "Chief Sullivan." The elderly minister closed the door behind him before continuing. 2 days after the warehouse incident, a woman came to me for counsel. She works in hospital administration, not Dr. Cooper, someone lower level. She was distressed about something she'd witnessed that night. She saw someone tampering with the personal effects of the injured officers while they were in surgery. Sullivan leaned forward. "Did she identify this person?" "She was too afraid," Wilson said regretfully. "She only said it was someone with authority, someone who shouldn't be questioned. She came to me because she didn't know who at the hospital she could trust. I need to speak with this woman immediately," Sullivan said. Wilson shook his head. "She left town the next day. Said she was visiting family in Arizona, but—" He reached into his coat pocket. "She gave me this, for safekeeping." He handed Sullivan a hospital identification badge with the photo and name clearly visible, Ryan Mitchell. "This was in the personal effects bag," Wilson explained. "She took it because she was certain she saw someone switch the bags after they'd been logged into hospital records." Sullivan stared at the badge, then at the still form visible through the window of the hospital room, where Shadow maintained his unwavering vigil. "We need to secure this room immediately," she ordered Ramirez. "No one enters except authorized medical personnel, and even then, they're supervised. And I want Officer Jenkins to collect Shadow's training equipment from Mason's locker specifically, the scent kits." While Ramirez made the arrangements, Sullivan returned to the hospital room, Mitchell's ID badge in hand. Shadow had repositioned himself, his head now resting gently on the patient's leg. The dog acknowledged Sullivan with a glance but didn't move. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she said quietly to Shadow. "That's why you wouldn't leave the station, wouldn't eat. You knew he wasn't dead." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face showing the strain of the day's emotional whiplash. "The nurse says we can stay tonight. I need to be here. If it's him." Sullivan nodded. "I'm stationing an officer outside this door. No one enters without my approval." As sunset painted the hospital windows in amber and gold, Sullivan returned to the police station to coordinate the expanding investigation. The scent kit specialized equipment used in Shadow's training would allow them to test the dog's certainty in a controlled way. At the station, Sullivan found her office door ajar unusual, since she distinctly remembered locking it before leaving for the funeral. Nothing appeared disturbed, but as she moved toward her desk, she noticed a small envelope that hadn't been there earlier. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing 3 typed lines. "Mason found proof of betrayal. Mitchell is not who he claims to be. Check the evidence from raid number 237. The evidence lockup was located in the station basement, a secure room with limited access. Sullivan used her key, signing the logbook before entering. Raid number 237. The Blackwood warehouse operation had generated 12 evidence boxes, all sealed and logged by Ethan Mason himself the day before the raid. Sullivan located the boxes easily enough, but something made her hesitate before opening them. Instead, she examined the security seals carefully. 3 of the 12 boxes showed signs of tampering, slight discrepancies in the evidence tape that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Taking these 3 boxes to a secure conference room, Sullivan began a methodical examination of their contents. In the second box, beneath folders of surveillance photos, she found a sealed envelope marked Confidential, E. Mason only. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note in Ethan's precise script, insurance policy. "If anything happens to me, give to FBI agent Teresa Hawkins, Philadelphia office." Sullivan stared at the USB drive, understanding suddenly the magnitude of what she might be holding. If Ethan had uncovered corruption serious enough to require an FBI contact as insurance, it could explain everything: the identity switch, the rushed funeral, even Dr. Cooper's nervousness. Her phone rang, displaying the hospital's number. "Sullivan," she answered tersely. "Chief, it's Ramirez. You need to get back here right away. Someone just tried to access the patient's room. Hospital security has him detained, but he's claiming to be from the prosecutor's office." "Don't let anyone near that room," Sullivan ordered. "I'm on my way." As she rushed toward her vehicle, a sedan with tinted windows pulled alongside her in the parking lot. The passenger window lowered, revealing a woman in her 40s with a severe haircut and eyes that missed nothing. "Chief Sullivan, I'm Agent Teresa Hawkins, FBI. I believe Ethan Mason was trying to contact me before he was injured. We need to talk." Sullivan studied the woman carefully, noting the standard-issue weapon visible beneath her jacket. "Prove you're Hawkins." The woman nodded approvingly, passing over credentials that Sullivan examined thoroughly. "Get in," Sullivan finally said, gesturing to her SUV. "We're heading to the hospital. Someone's been declared dead who might be very much alive, and a lot of people seem invested in keeping it that way." As they drove, Sullivan filled Hawkins in on the day's discoveries. "Mason contacted me 3 weeks ago," Hawkins confirmed. "Said he had evidence of corruption reaching into local law enforcement, the judiciary, and possibly the hospital administration, all connected to Blackwood's operation. He was gathering final proof before sending everything. "And you think this proof is what got him shot?" Sullivan asked. "I think," Hawkins said grimly, "that Thomas Blackwood has spent millions building a distribution network protected by people in positions of authority, people who would do anything, including falsifying death certificates and switching identities, to protect themselves and eliminate threats." At the hospital, they found Ramirez standing guard outside the patient's room, with Shadow still inside. The dog had moved into an alert posture, sensing the tension in the air. The man who tried to enter identified himself as Assistant District Attorney Mark Collins. Ramirez reported. Except, when hospital security called the DA's office to verify, they confirmed Collins is currently in court in Harrisburg. "Where is he now?" Sullivan demanded. "Security office, first floor. Says he won't talk to anyone but hospital administration." Sullivan turned to Hawkins. "I think it's time we had a conversation with our fake ADA." "First," Hawkins countered, "I'd like to see this patient who may or may not be Officer Mason." They entered the room quietly. Sarah Mason had fallen asleep in a chair beside the bed, one hand resting near the patient's arm. Shadow acknowledged their presence with a soft whine, but maintained his protective position. "The DNA tests won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest," Sullivan whispered. "But Shadow has no doubts." Hawkins studied the bandaged figure, then turned her attention to Shadow. "This dog served with Mason in Afghanistan. Correct military working dog." Sullivan nodded. "How did you know?" "Mason mentioned it when we spoke. Said Shadow was the reason he joined the K-9 unit here, some connection from their military service, though he didn't elaborate." Hawkins knelt beside Shadow, allowing the dog to sniff her hand before gently examining his collar. "Did you know these military dogs receive specialized training in identifying chemical compounds, not just explosives and drugs, but certain preservatives and alterations used in forgeries?" "You're saying Shadow recognized something about the body in the casket?" Sullivan asked. "I'm saying," Hawkins replied, rising to her feet, "that if someone wanted to pass off another body as Mason's, they'd need to use specific chemicals to mask decomposition differences. Chemicals this dog would recognize from his military training." A nurse appeared in the doorway, hesitating when she saw the group. "Excuse me, but I need to check the patient's vitals." Sullivan stepped aside to allow her access, watching carefully as the young woman efficiently checked monitors and adjusted an IV line. "There's been some increased brain activity in the last few hours," the nurse commented, making notes on her tablet. "It's a positive sign." Increased activity. Sarah had awakened, instantly alert. What does that mean? It could mean he's starting to emerge from the coma. The nurse explained cautiously. "These things are unpredictable, but the patterns we're seeing are encouraging." After the nurse left, Hawkins turned to Sullivan. "I think it's time we had a chat with our visitor downstairs. If someone's trying to access this room using false credentials, they clearly aren't finished tying up loose ends." Sullivan nodded grimly. "Mrs. Mason, we'll have 2 officers outside this door at all times now. No one enters without my direct approval." As they left, Shadow repositioned himself between the door and the bed, his posture communicating a clear message. No one would harm his handler while he stood guard. In the hospital security office, the man claiming to be ADA Collins sat with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to privilege. His tailored suit and manicured appearance projected authority. but his eyes betrayed nervousness when Sullivan and Hawkins entered. "Chief Sullivan," he began smoothly, "there seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm here on official business from the district attorney's office concerning the officer injured in the line of duty." Sullivan remained standing, deliberately looming over him. "That's interesting, since the actual Mark Collins is currently in Harrisburg, presenting evidence in the Westmoreland County corruption case." The man's composure faltered momentarily. "A simple mix-up. My identification clearly—" "Cut the act," Hawkins interrupted, placing her FBI credentials on the table. "We know about the identity switch at the hospital. We know about the connection between Mitchell's emergency contact and Thomas Blackwood. What we don't know yet is how high this goes and exactly who you are." The man's eyes darted between them, calculating. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "I want immunity." "That depends entirely on what you have to offer," Hawkins replied coldly. "Names, dates, records of payments, the entire operation." He leaned forward. "I'm not the mastermind here. I'm just a facilitator who got in too deep." "And your real name?" Sullivan demanded. "David Reeves. I worked for Judge Henderson as a legal researcher, but my actual job was coordinating between Henderson and Blackwood's organization." Sullivan and Hawkins exchanged glances. Judge Henderson, the same judge who had been at the funeral, who had demanded Shadow be removed when the dog began barking at the casket. "Why are you here?" Sullivan asked. "What were you hoping to accomplish by accessing that hospital room?" Reeves hesitated. "Confirmation. The operation to switch the identities went wrong. It was supposed to be clean, declare Mason dead, ensure Mitchell never woke up from his coma, remove the only two officers who could testify about what they found at the warehouse. But then there was that damn dog at the funeral. And now," Hawkins pressed, "now Henderson's panicking. He sent me to verify whether Mason is actually alive and what condition he's in." Reeves swallowed hard. "If he wakes up and remembers what happened at the warehouse, what he discovered about the judge's involvement, everyone goes down." Sullivan's phone buzzed with a text from Ramirez. "Urgent. Dr. Cooper trying to transfer patient to County General, claiming better facilities for coma patients." "Agent Hawkins," Sullivan said, keeping her expression neutral, "I believe we need to continue this interview at the federal building in Pittsburgh. Mr. Reeves has much more to tell us in a more secure environment." As they escorted Reeves to a patrol car, Sullivan quietly filled Hawkins in on the latest development. "Cooper's making her move. She knows we're closing in." "Go," Hawkins said, taking charge of the prisoner. "I'll handle Reeves and call in additional FBI support. Keep that patient secure at all costs." Sullivan raced back to the third floor, where she found Dr. Cooper arguing with Ramirez outside the patient's room. "This is a medical decision, not a police matter," Cooper was insisting. "County General has a specialized neurology unit that can better serve this patient." "No transfers without Chief Sullivan's approval," Ramirez repeated firmly. "Those are my orders." "Your orders don't supersede medical necessity," Cooper snapped. "Actually," Sullivan interrupted, approaching rapidly, "in a criminal investigation, they do." "Dr. Cooper, you're interfering with an active federal investigation into corruption and attempted murder of a police officer." Cooper's professional demeanor cracked. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. The hospital can't afford a scandal like this. If word gets out that we misidentified a deceased officer—" "Is that what this is about?" Sullivan asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Protecting the hospital's reputation? Or is it about protecting whoever paid you to make sure Ethan Mason stayed dead?" Before Cooper could respond, a commotion erupted from inside the patient's room, Shadow barking urgently, followed by Sarah's startled cry. Sullivan pushed past Cooper into the room, hand on her weapon, expecting danger. Instead, she found Sarah bent over the bed, tears streaming down her face, while Shadow pranced excitedly beside them. On the bed, the patient's eyes were open, confused but unmistakably aware. "He squeezed my hand," Sarah sobbed. "He's waking up." Sullivan moved closer, studying the visible portions of the patient's face. Even through the bandages, she could now recognize the distinctive scar near his right eye, a small mark from childhood that Ethan had carried all his life. "Welcome back, Mason," she said softly. "You've caused quite a stir." The next 48 hours transformed Pinewood Valley Memorial's 3rd floor into a fortress. FBI agents established a security perimeter around Ethan's room, vetting every medical professional who entered. Shadow, finally convinced to leave his handler's side long enough for proper meals and brief outdoor breaks, remained the patient's most vigilant guardian. Ethan's return to consciousness progressed in frustrating increments. His eyes would open, focus briefly, then close again. Occasionally he would squeeze Sarah's hand in response to questions. But he couldn't speak through the breathing tube, and the doctors cautioned against removing it prematurely. "Brain trauma is unpredictable," explained Dr. Winters, a neurologist brought in from Pittsburgh at Agent Hawkins' insistence. "The fact that he's responding at all is encouraging. But we need to manage expectations. Memory loss, personality changes, cognitive impairments, all are possible." Sarah nodded stoically, having already weathered the emotional whiplash of losing her son and finding him again. "He's alive," she said simply. "Everything else we can handle." By the 3rd morning, evidence against the conspiracy had mounted dramatically. Dr. Cooper, faced with irrefutable proof of her complicity, had agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Judge Henderson, alerted by an unknown source that his scheme was unraveling, had abandoned his chambers and disappeared. Most significantly, Thomas Blackwood had been apprehended attempting to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands. The DNA results confirmed what Shadow had known all along. The comatose patient was indeed Ethan Mason. The body in the casket was identified as Carlos Vega, a known Blackwood enforcer who had been reported missing 3 weeks before the warehouse raid. They needed a body approximately Mason's age and build, Agent Hawkins explained to Sullivan in the small conference room they'd commandeered. Vega had fallen out of favor with Blackwood. He served a dual purpose, removing a liability while providing a convenient corpse. Sullivan shook her head in disgust. "And the hospital went along with this charade." "Not the hospital as an institution," Hawkins clarified. "Cooper and 2 staff members she personally selected. The rest of the medical team genuinely believed they were treating Ryan Mitchell in that room." "Speaking of Mitchell," Sullivan said, "any leads on his actual whereabouts?" Hawkins hesitated. "That's complicated. We've confirmed he's not the man Vega was substituted for. The working theory is that the real Mitchell is either in hiding or—" She left the alternative unspoken. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Ramirez entered, looking simultaneously exhausted and energized. "Chief, Agent Hawkins, he's talking." They rushed to Ethan's room, where the breathing tube had been removed and replaced with a nasal cannula. His face remained partially bandaged, but his eyes were clear and alert, tracking movement as they entered. Sarah sat beside him, clutching his hand, her face radiant with cautious joy. "Mason," Sullivan said softly, approaching the bed. "Good to have you back." Ethan's voice emerged as a raspy whisper. "Shadow. On cue." The German shepherd placed his front paws carefully on the edge of the bed, leaning forward just enough for Ethan to see him. A ghost of a smile crossed the injured officer's face. "Good boy," he managed. Agent Hawkins stepped forward. "Officer Mason, I'm Teresa Hawkins, FBI. We spoke briefly before your injury. Do you remember?" Ethan's brow furrowed with concentration. "Warehouse. Evidence." He swallowed painfully. "Mitchell." "Yes," Hawkins encouraged. "What about Mitchell? What do you remember?" "Not Mitchell." Ethan's eyes closed momentarily, the effort of speaking clearly taxing his limited strength. "Undercover, DEA." Sullivan and Hawkins exchanged startled glances. "You're saying Ryan Mitchell was an undercover DEA agent?" Sullivan asked. Ethan managed a weak nod. "Told me. Night of raid. Blackwood had inside man. Not him. Someone else." "Did he tell you who?" Hawkins pressed gently. "No time." Ethan's breathing grew labored. "Ambush. Came from behind. Mitchell. Pushed me down. Took first shots." Dr. Winters stepped forward. "That's enough for now. He needs rest." As they left Ethan to sleep, Sullivan pulled Hawkins aside in the hallway. "DEA. Why weren't we informed there was an undercover operation in my jurisdiction?" "Compartmentalization," Hawkins replied. "If Mitchell was deep undercover, his operation would have been known to only a handful of people, even within the DEA. It explains the changed emergency contact, probably his handler disguised as an attorney. But where is he now? And whose body was in that ambulance they thought was Ethan's?" Hawkins frowned. "Let me make some calls." By evening, the picture had become both clearer and more disturbing. Hawkins returned from a series of secure calls, looking grim. Mitchell was indeed DEA, working deep cover for nearly 3 years. His mission was to infiltrate Blackwood's distribution network and identify his law enforcement connections. He requested transfer to Pinewood specifically to work with Mason after learning your K-9 unit was getting close to major evidence. So he was protecting Ethan, not setting him up, Sullivan mused. Exactly. But here's where it gets complicated. The DEA has no idea where Mitchell is. His handler lost contact the night of the raid. He's officially missing. Sullivan paced the small room. So we have 2 bodies, Vega in the casket and another at the morgue who was supposed to be Mitchell, but neither is actually Mitchell. The second body has been identified as Peter Lawson, a hospital orderly with a passing resemblance to Mitchell. He was reported missing the day after the raid. Jesus, Sullivan muttered. They killed an innocent hospital worker just to maintain their cover story. Blackwood's organization doesn't leave loose ends, Hawkins said grimly. Which brings me to the other development. Judge Henderson was found dead in his fishing cabin an hour ago. Single gunshot wound, apparent suicide. Convenient, Sullivan observed. Very too convenient. As darkness fell over Pinewood Valley, security around the hospital tightened further. Additional FBI agents arrived, setting up surveillance equipment and posting guards at all entrances. Shadow, having reluctantly accepted Ramirez as a temporary handler for bathroom breaks, returned to his position beside Ethan's bed. Around midnight, as Sarah dozed in the recliner beside her son, Shadow suddenly raised his head, ears alert. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Sarah woke instantly. "What is it, boy?" The German shepherd slipped from the room before she could stop him, moving silently down the darkened corridor. The FBI agent posted outside Ethan's door followed, hand on his weapon. Shadow tracked a scent to the service elevator, pawing insistently at the doors. When they didn't open, he raced toward the emergency stairs, the agent struggling to keep pace. Down 3 flights of stairs, through the basement corridor, past the laundry facilities, Shadow moved with single-minded purpose, following a trail only he could detect. He finally stopped outside a maintenance room deep in the hospital's substructure, growling softly at the closed door. The agent radioed for backup before carefully testing the handle. The door was locked. Shadow's growl intensified. Within minutes, additional agents arrived with hospital security, who unlocked the door. Inside, amidst dusty equipment and forgotten supplies, they found a man bloodied, bound, but alive. "Mitchell," the agent breathed, recognizing him from case photos. Ryan Mitchell had been severely beaten, his face swollen almost beyond recognition, but his eyes were alert as they cut the zip ties securing his wrists and ankles. "Mason," he croaked. "Is Mason alive?" "Yes," the agent confirmed, calling for medical assistance. "We found him. He's recovering." Mitchell sagged with relief. "Thank God. I thought I was too late." "What happened?" the agent asked, helping Mitchell to a sitting position. "Figured out who the inside man was. Night of the raid. They didn't just want to stop the bust, they wanted to eliminate me and Mason permanently. We knew too much." Mitchell winced as he shifted position. "Been here since. They grabbed me from ICU recovery, switched me with a body when they realized I survived surgery." "Who's the inside man?" "Mitchell." The undercover agent's eyes hardened. "Chief Medical Examiner Robert Phillips. He's been falsifying autopsy reports for Blackwood for years, ruling overdoses as heart attacks, identifying bodies incorrectly to help disappear people." Mitchell coughed painfully. "He's the one who certified Mason's death without performing a proper autopsy?" Shadow, having confirmed the rescue was underway, had already disappeared, racing back toward Ethan's room with renewed urgency. The dog burst into the room just as Sarah noticed a nurse she didn't recognize checking Ethan's IV. The woman's hand froze above the port as Shadow launched himself toward her with a ferocious snarl. Sarah lunged for the call button as the nurse produced a syringe from her pocket. Shadow's teeth clamped around her wrist, causing her to drop the syringe with a cry of pain and rage. The FBI agent stationed outside rushed in at the commotion, weapon drawn. "FBI, don't move!" The imposter nurse raised her hands, blood dripping from the puncture wounds in her wrist where Shadow's teeth had broken skin. "Check the syringe," Sarah demanded, positioning herself protectively between the woman and her son. Analysis later confirmed the syringe contained a lethal dose of potassium chloride enough to stop Ethan's heart and make it appear he had suffered a natural complication from his injuries. The woman was identified as Lisa Phillips, wife of Chief Medical Examiner Robert Phillips, and sister of Thomas Blackwood. The conspiracy had deeper family connections than anyone had suspected. By dawn, both Phillips and his wife were in federal custody, the final pieces of Blackwood's protection network dismantled. Mitchell, despite his injuries, insisted on giving his statement immediately, providing the crucial evidence needed to connect all the conspirators. "Mason and I were getting close," he explained from his hospital bed, 2 rooms down from Ethan's. "Too close. We had financial records linking Henderson to offshore accounts tied to Blackwood. We had falsified medical reports with Phillips' signature. We had everything." "But you didn't tell anyone else?" Sullivan asked. Mitchell shook his head carefully. "Couldn't risk it. We didn't know how high this went. Mason was preparing a secure file for the FBI when we got the tip about the warehouse." "The warehouse was a trap," Hawkins concluded. "Textbook. They never expected both of us to survive, and they had Phillips ready to declare whichever of us died as officially deceased. When we both survived initially, they had to improvise, switch identities, plant a different body, create confusion. They didn't count on Shadow," Sullivan observed, glancing at the German shepherd who had finally been persuaded to rest on a blanket near the window of Ethan's room. "No one ever does," Mitchell said with a hint of admiration. "That dog is something else." As morning light filled the valley, Ethan's condition continued to improve incrementally. He could speak in short sentences, and his memory of events leading to the raid seemed largely intact. The neurologist remained cautiously optimistic. "Brain swelling has decreased significantly," Dr. Winters reported. "We'll run another MRI this afternoon, but his cognitive responses are encouraging. He's young, fit, and highly motivated to recover." Sarah, who had hardly left her son's side in 3 days, finally agreed to return home for a shower and a few hours of real sleep. "Shadow stays," she insisted. And no one argued the dog had earned his place as Ethan's primary guardian. In the quiet hospital room, Ethan drifted between sleep and wakefulness, his mind gradually reassembling the fragments of what had happened. He remembered the warehouse, the sudden realization they'd walked into a trap, Mitchell shoving him down as gunshots erupted from behind. He remembered Mitchell's hurried whisper just before the ambush. "I'm DEA. We've been compromised. Trust no one but your dog." His hand found Shadow's fur, fingers weakly tangling in the coarse black and tan coat. The German shepherd shifted closer, resting his head gently against Ethan's side. "You found me," Ethan murmured. "Good boy." Outside the window, fall leaves spiraled down from the maple trees flanking the hospital grounds, their fiery colors set ablaze by morning light. In the mountains beyond Pinewood Valley, mist rose from the hollows like departing ghosts. Agent Hawkins observed this peaceful scene from the doorway, knowing the tranquility was deceptive. Blackwood's arrest had sent shockwaves through his organization. There would be power struggles, retribution, loose ends seeking closure. The threat wasn't entirely eliminated. She watched as Ethan's breathing deepened into sleep, his hand still resting on Shadow's back. The dog's eyes met hers across the room, alert, intelligent, unwavering in his vigil. "We'll keep you both safe," she promised quietly. "Whatever it takes." Shadow blinked once in acknowledgement before returning his attention to his handler, the remarkable bond between them having already survived death itself. The first true setback came on the 5th day. Ethan had been making steady progress, speaking in longer sentences, attempting to sit up with assistance, even managing to feed himself with his uninjured arm. The doctors had begun discussing rehabilitation options. and Sarah had allowed herself to believe the worst was behind them. Then, during a routine neurological assessment, Ethan suddenly stiffened, his eyes rolling back as monitors erupted in frantic beeping. "He's seizing," the neurologist shouted, triggering an immediate response from the medical team. Shadow, who had been dozing beneath the window, leapt to his feet with a distressed whine as Sarah was rushed from the room. For 17 agonizing minutes, Sarah and Shadow waited in the hallway while medical personnel fought to stabilize Ethan. The German shepherd paced anxiously, whimpering whenever a new person entered the room, his distress mirroring Sarah's own mounting terror. When Dr. Winters finally emerged, his expression was grave. "The brain trauma was more extensive than we initially thought," he explained gently. "The increased activity has created swelling that's putting pressure on critical areas. We're administering medication to reduce the inflammation, but if it doesn't respond quickly, we may need to consider surgical intervention." "Surgery?" Sarah's voice wavered. "But he was doing so well?" "Brain injuries are unpredictable, Mrs. Mason. Sometimes improvement precedes complications. Think of it as the brain working harder as it heals. That extra effort can create swelling." The medication stabilized Ethan's condition, but he remained unconscious, the promising lucidity of previous days replaced by an unsettling stillness. The breathing tube was reinserted as a precaution, and additional monitoring equipment crowded the small room, their mechanical rhythms a constant reminder of how precarious his recovery remained. Shadow refused to leave, even for brief walks, his food and water brought to Ethan's room. The dog maintained a silent vigil, moving only to adjust his position as medical staff worked around him. Occasionally, he would rest his head on the edge of the mattress, amber eyes fixed on Ethan's face with an intensity that moved even the most clinically detached healthcare providers. Agent Hawkins divided her time between the hospital and the expanding investigation, which had uncovered corruption extending beyond Pinewood Valley to neighboring counties. Judge Henderson's financial records revealed payments to at least 6 other law enforcement officials in the region, creating a protected corridor for Blackwood's distribution network. "The good news," she told Sullivan during a brief update, "is that Mitchell's testimony and the evidence from Mason's USB drive give us an airtight case against Blackwood and his associates. The bad news is that several key players remain unaccounted for, including Blackwood's brother-in-law Kenneth Reeves, who managed much of the organization's finances." Sullivan glanced toward Ethan's room, where Shadow's silhouette was visible through the doorway. "Any identified threats to Mason or Mitchell?" "Nothing specific, but Blackwood's organization is wounded, not eliminated. The most dangerous time is often when these networks are collapsing." Hawkins hesitated. "How's he doing?" Sullivan shook her head slightly. "Holding stable, but no improvement since the seizure. Doctor says the next 48 hours are critical." In the small waiting area that had become their de facto headquarters, Ryan Mitchell reviewed case files from his wheelchair, his own injuries preventing him from more active participation in the investigation. Despite medical advice to rest, he had insisted on remaining involved, driven by a personal sense of responsibility for Ethan's condition. "I should have warned him sooner," he confided to Sarah during one of her brief breaks from Ethan's bedside. "I knew something was wrong with the warehouse tip, but I thought we could handle it, get the evidence, and expose the whole operation." Sarah studied the younger officer, noting the guilt etched in his features. "Ethan made his own choices," she said quietly. "He knew the risks of his profession." "Your son saved my life," Mitchell continued. When the shooting started, I went down first. Ethan could have taken cover, called for backup, saved himself. Instead, he dragged me behind a storage container, returned fire to give us a chance. He looked away, blinking rapidly. The last thing I remember is him calling for Shadow. Then nothing until I woke up tied to that pipe in the basement. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Winters, his expression cautiously optimistic. The latest scans show the swelling has begun to subside. It's modest progress, but significant. If this trend continues overnight, we may be able to reduce the sedation tomorrow and reassess his neurological status. That evening, Sarah finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep in the recliner beside Ethan's bed. Shadow maintained his watch, ears perking up at every change in the monitoring equipment's rhythm, at every footstep passing in the hallway. Shortly after midnight, Ethan's fingers twitched, then curled slightly around the edge of the blanket. Shadow immediately rose, pressing his muzzle gently against Ethan's hand. The fingers twitched again, then slowly, deliberately, moved to rest against the dog's fur. Shadow whined softly, careful not to wake Sarah, his tail offering the briefest of hopeful wags. For several minutes, man and dog remained connected by that tenuous touch, Ethan seemingly unconscious yet somehow aware of his companion's presence. By morning, the medical team confirmed what Shadow had already sensed. Ethan was fighting his way back again. The swelling had decreased enough to begin reducing the sedation, and by afternoon, he was breathing on his own once more. The ventilator removed. The human brain is remarkably resilient, Dr. Winters explained, particularly in younger patients, but recovery isn't linear. There will be good days and challenging ones ahead. What no one could predict was the psychological impact of Ethan's injuries. As sedation was withdrawn completely, he began experiencing periods of confusion and agitation. He would wake disoriented, sometimes not recognizing Sarah or his surroundings, his memories fragmented and unreliable. "Where's Claire?" he asked repeatedly during one particularly difficult afternoon, referring to his late wife. "She was just here with Emma." "Where did they go?" Sarah's heart broke anew with each question, each confused search for people long gone. "Claire and Emma aren't here, sweetheart," she would explain gently. "They've been gone for some time." Ethan's face would crumple in confusion, then vacant acceptance, before sleep claimed him again. When he woke next, the cycle would repeat, sometimes with different questions, different missing pieces, but always with the same underlying disorientation. Through it all, Shadow remained his one constant anchor. Regardless of Ethan's mental state, he always responded to the dog's presence, always seemed calmer when his hand rested on Shadow's fur. It was as if their connection existed on a level deeper than conscious memory, immune to the damage inflicted on Ethan's brain. "It's actually not uncommon," the hospital's neuropsychologist explained after observing their interaction. "Emotional bonds, particularly those formed under stress or trauma, can persist even when declarative memory is compromised. The relationship with his dog may be stored in different neural pathways than his biographical memories." On the 10th day after the seizure, Sarah arrived at the hospital to find Ethan sitting up in bed, Shadow beside him, both watching the door expectantly. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice weak but clear. "What day is it?" Sarah approached cautiously. having learned that moments of lucidity could be fleeting. "It's Tuesday, November 2nd. Ethan frowned. "The raid was October 12th. I've lost 3 weeks. You remember the raid?" Sarah asked gently, taking his hand. "Pieces, warehouse, gunfire." His eyes drifted to Shadow. "He wasn't with me. They made me leave him in the car." "That's right," Sarah confirmed, hope rising cautiously in her chest. "Do you know where you are now?" "Hospital. Pinewood Valley Memorial." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "They tried to kill me. Switch me with someone else." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Yes, but Shadow knew. He never stopped looking for you." Ethan managed a weak smile, fingers finding the dog's ears. "Good boy." Dr. Winters was encouraged by this development, but cautioned against excessive optimism. Memory can return in fragments, sometimes temporarily. The fact that he recalls the raid and understands what happened afterward is positive, but there may still be significant gaps or periods of confusion ahead. The doctor's warning proved prescient. By evening, Ethan had slipped back into confusion, asking repeatedly about the warehouse raid as if it hadn't happened yet, unable to retain new information for more than a few minutes. The brief window of clarity had closed, leaving behind fear and frustration. During one particularly difficult moment, when Ethan became agitated to the point of trying to remove his IV, Shadow placed himself firmly across Ethan's lap, the gentle weight and warmth of the dog's body having an almost immediate calming effect. "It's like he knows exactly what Mason needs. Sometimes before the medical staff does," Agent Hawkins observed, watching through the window as Ethan gradually relaxed, his hand absently stroking Shadow's back. "They've been through hell together before this," Sullivan replied. "Afghanistan, the loss of Mason's family, the warehouse raid. That kind of bond doesn't break easily." "I've been thinking about that," Hawkins said thoughtfully. "There's something about their military connection we're missing." Mitchell mentioned Mason specifically requested Shadow when he joined the K-9 unit, but the official record shows Shadow was assigned to him as a last resort because no other handler could work with him. Sullivan frowned. "You think they knew each other before Pinewood?" "I think there might be more to their story than either of us knows. And it might explain why Shadow was so certain, so determined, when everyone else accepted that Mason was dead." As darkness fell over the mountains, enveloping the hospital in premature night, Sarah reluctantly prepared to leave for a few hours of rest at home. The FBI security detail remained in place outside Ethan's door, and Shadow, as always, maintained his position beside the bed. "I'll be back in the morning," Sarah promised, kissing her son's forehead. "Shadow will stay with you." Ethan, drifting between sleep and consciousness, mumbled something indistinct. Then, as Sarah reached the door, his voice emerged with sudden clarity. "He found me before, too, in the valley, after the ambush." Sarah turned back, but Ethan's eyes had already closed, his breathing deepening into sleep. Shadow watched her from his place on the bed, amber eyes reflecting knowledge she didn't share. Secrets from a battlefield half a world away. The connection between Ethan and Shadow began to intrigue Agent Hawkins as much as the criminal conspiracy she was investigating. During a rare moment when Ethan was both awake and lucid, she gently probed for details. "You mentioned Shadow found you before," she said, sitting beside his bed while Sarah had gone for coffee. "In a valley, after an ambush." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the window, where autumn was giving way to early winter. the mountains dusted with the first tentative snow. Helmand Province, 2015. His voice was stronger now, though still rough at the edges. Our convoy hit an IED. 3 vehicles, 14 men. I was thrown clear, but with a broken leg and shrapnel wounds. Shadow, sensing the shift in his handler's mood, moved closer, resting his head on Ethan's lap. The officer's fingers automatically found the dog's ears, the familiar motion seeming to ground him in the present while he spoke of the past. I dragged myself about half a mile from the ambush site, afraid the attackers would return, passed out in a drainage culvert. By all rights, I should have died there. Blood loss. Exposure. No radio to call for help. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. But there was this dog. Military working dog, assigned to our unit for explosives detection. His handler had been in the lead vehicle. Killed instantly. Hawkins glanced at Shadow, beginning to understand. This was Shadow. Ethan nodded, his hand continuing its gentle rhythm across the German shepherd's head. Different name, then. Rex. He'd been thrown clear, too. Injured but mobile. Somehow he tracked me to that culvert, stayed with me, kept me warm through the night. When the rescue team finally came the next morning, he led them straight to me. You served together, Hawkins said softly, the missing piece finally clicking into place. For 6 more months, until my tour ended. I tried to adopt him when I rotated home, but he was still considered active duty, still had work to do. Ethan's gaze dropped to Shadow. I never expected to see him again. Then how did you end up together in Pinewood? Pure chance. I joined the department. Heard they were starting a K-9 unit. When they brought in this problem dog that no one could handle, a former military working dog with PTSD, I knew immediately. He had a new name, new handlers. But those eyes... Ethan shook his head slightly. I'd never forget those eyes. The pieces aligned for Hawkins why Shadow had been so certain in the cemetery, so persistent when everyone else accepted Ethan's death. The dog hadn't just been protecting his current handler, he had been honoring a bond forged in blood and survival years earlier. Did anyone else know about your history together? Ethan's brow furrowed with effort. Mitchell figured it out toward the end. Noticed how we worked together, asked questions. I told him just before the raid. His expression darkened. Mitchell, is he... He's alive, Hawkins reassured him. Recovering down the hall. He was held captive in the hospital basement the whole time. Relief washed across Ethan's features. He saved my life at the warehouse. Took bullets meant for me. This matched Mitchell's account, but hearing it confirmed by Ethan strengthened the case they were building. The conspiracy had targeted both officers, attempting to eliminate the only 2 people who had uncovered the full extent of Blackwood's operation and its law enforcement protection. As Hawkins gently guided the conversation toward the evidence they'd gathered before the raid, she noticed Ethan struggling to maintain focus. His sentences became shorter, his gaze occasionally drifting as if losing the thread of conversation. The evidence, he said finally, pressing his palm against his forehead in frustration. It's all fragments now. I know we found something important in the financial records, something that connected Henderson directly to Blackwood. Mitchell was going to... His voice trailed off, confusion clouding his features. Shadow whined softly, sensing his handler's distress. It's okay, Hawkins said gently. Mitchell filled in most of the gaps. And we found your USB drive. Ethan's expression cleared momentarily. The cemetery. Did Shadow? Yes, she confirmed. Shadow alerted at the funeral. He knew the body wasn't yours. A tired smile touched Ethan's lips as his hand found Shadow's fur again. Smart boy. Always. Looking out for me. Hawkins shared these insights with Sullivan later that day, as they reviewed the expanding case file in the hospital's small conference room. Their connection explains a lot, Sullivan agreed. But I'm more concerned about Mason's cognitive status. The doctors say these memory issues could be permanent. Even if he recovers physically, he might never be able to testify effectively. Mitchell's testimony is solid, Hawkins reminded her, and the documentary evidence is overwhelming. We don't necessarily need Mason on the stand to make the case against Blackwood and his network. It's not just about the case, Sullivan said quietly. It's about his future. A K-9 officer with significant memory impairment? She left the implication unspoken, but Hawkins understood. Ethan's career, the life he'd built for himself after losing his family, might be yet another casualty of Blackwood's conspiracy. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, running footsteps. Sullivan was on her feet immediately, hand instinctively moving toward her weapon as she strode to the door. One of the FBI agents posted on the floor rushed toward them. Agent Hawkins Kenneth Reeves was just spotted in the hospital parking garage. Security cameras picked him up entering the north stairwell. Hawkins's expression hardened. Blackwood's brother-in-law. Full hospital lockdown. Now. And get additional agents to Mason's and Mitchell's rooms immediately. As security protocols activated throughout the building, Sullivan sprinted toward Ethan's room, Hawkins close behind. They found the door secured, the FBI agent outside on high alert, weapon drawn but positioned discreetly at his side to avoid alarming patients and staff. All clear here, the agent reported. No unauthorized access attempts. Through the window, they could see Sarah reading quietly to Ethan, who appeared to be dozing, one hand resting on Shadow's back. The domestic tranquility of the scene stood in sharp contrast to the tension gripping the rest of the hospital. Mitchell, Hawkins asked tersely. Secured. 2 agents with him. Security teams conducted a methodical sweep of the building, floor by floor, while hospital staff implemented practiced emergency procedures. 90 minutes later, the search concluded without locating Kenneth Reeves. He must have left before we locked down, the security chief reported. We're reviewing all camera footage, but there are blind spots in the older sections of the building. Hawkins wasn't convinced. Or he's still here, hiding. This hospital has plenty of storage rooms, maintenance areas, places to lay low. What would be his objective? Sullivan wondered aloud. If he wanted to silence Mason or Mitchell, why not make his move immediately? Reconnaissance, Hawkins suggested grimly. Studying security patterns, planning a more coordinated attempt. These organizations don't give up easily, especially when key members are facing life sentences. The lockdown was eventually lifted, but security remained heightened, with additional agents assigned to the floor and plainclothes officers stationed throughout the hospital. The incident, while unresolved, had an unexpected benefit. It accelerated plans to transfer both Ethan and Mitchell to a more secure medical facility in Pittsburgh. We've been discussing this move for several days, Dr. Winters explained to Sarah. The FBI's medical center is better equipped for Officer Mason's specific neurological needs, and the security there is unparalleled. Today's incident only confirms it's the right decision. Sarah nodded, having already concluded her son would be safer away from Pinewood Valley. When, first light tomorrow, if his condition remains stable overnight. As preparations for the transfer proceeded, Ethan experienced another period of remarkable clarity. During the evening neurological assessment, he not only recognized everyone in the room but demonstrated improved recall of recent events. "Kenneth Reeves," he said suddenly, as the doctor was concluding the examination. "He's the one who paid off Henderson. I remember now. We traced payments through an offshore account in the Caymans, shell companies that led back to Reeves." Agent Hawkins, who had stepped into the room for the assessment, immediately moved closer. "You're sure about this, Mason?" Ethan nodded, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. Mitchell found the connection. Reeves was using his position at First Mountain Bank to launder money for the entire operation. Millions. And he had access to confidential financial information about potential targets for blackmail. This aligned with fragments of evidence they'd already gathered, but Ethan's confirmation provided the connective tissue they needed to strengthen the case. Hawkins made notes as Ethan continued, his memory temporarily unlocked, spilling details about meetings, documents, surveillance operations conducted before the warehouse raid. "This is incredibly helpful," Hawkins told him when he finally exhausted his recollections. "You've filled in several critical gaps in our understanding of the network." Ethan's expression turned grave. Reeves was the money man, but he was also Blackwood's enforcer when needed. Cold, methodical. If he's here, he's not just gathering information. He's tying up loose ends. Dr. Winters, observing from across the room, recognized signs of fatigue beginning to overtake his patient. "That's enough for tonight. Officer Mason needs rest before tomorrow's transfer." As the room cleared, Sarah took her usual place in the recliner beside the bed, shadow settling at her feet. The medical team had initially resisted allowing the dog to accompany Ethan in the ambulance to Pittsburgh, but both Sullivan and Hawkins had intervened, citing Shadow's proven value to both security and Ethan's psychological well-being. "Do you think you'll remember all this tomorrow?" Sarah asked softly, once they were alone. The unpredictable nature of Ethan's memory had become their new normal, each period of clarity treasured but not taken for granted. "I don't know," he admitted, fatigue evident in his voice. "It comes and goes. Like trying to tune an old radio, sometimes the signal is clear. Sometimes it's just static." His hand found Shadow's head, fingers gently scratching behind the dog's ears. "But he remembers for both of us." As Sarah watched her son drift toward sleep, she reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed in less than a month. The funeral that wasn't, the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government, her son's struggle to reclaim not just his life but his very identity, it was almost too much to comprehend. Yet amid all the chaos and uncertainty, one constant remained the unwavering loyalty of the German shepherd who had saved Ethan not once, but twice, spanning continents and years. Continents. Shadow had recognized truth when everyone else accepted lies, had maintained his vigil when all hope seemed lost. Outside the window, snowflakes began to fall, delicate and tentative against the darkness, the first true snow of the season. Shadow watched their descent with quiet attention, his amber eyes reflecting the soft light from Ethan's monitors. Dr. Winters made one final check before midnight, reviewing vitals and medication levels in preparation for morning's transfer. "Everything looks stable," he reported quietly to Sarah. The transport team will arrive at 5:30 a.m. to begin preparations. What none of them realized, as the hospital settled into the quiet rhythms of night, was that Kenneth Reeves had indeed left the building, but only temporarily. His reconnaissance complete, he had formulated his plan, identified vulnerabilities in the security protocols, and selected his moment to strike. That moment would come with the transfer itself, when the protective bubble around Ethan would be at its most vulnerable between the security of the hospital and the fortress awaiting him in Pittsburgh. All Reeves needed was patience, precision, and the element of surprise. Shadow, however, had developed an uncanny ability to sense threats to his handler long before they materialized. As midnight passed and the new day technically began, the German shepherd shifted position, moving from Sarah's feet to the foot of Ethan's bed, his posture alert rather than restful, his senses attuned to dangers still hours away but approaching with the inevitability of dawn. The snow continued through the early morning hours, transforming Pinewood Valley into a winter landscape that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. By 5:00 a.m., an inch of fresh powder covered the hospital parking lot, and the transport team arriving from Pittsburgh moved with the cautious efficiency of professionals who understood both the medical and security stakes of their mission. Agent Hawkins supervised the preparations personally, checking credentials, reviewing the route, and confirming security protocols with each member of the escort team. The plan called for 2 identical medical transport vehicles, one containing Ethan, the other, Mitchell, accompanied by a 4-vehicle FBI escort. Route information was compartmentalized, with only Hawkins and the lead driver knowing the complete path to Pittsburgh. "Decoy vehicles will leave through the main entrance," she explained to Sullivan, who had arrived before dawn despite having been up most of the night coordinating with local officers. "The actual transports will exit through the service area 10 minutes later, if anyone's watching. They'll follow the decoys." Sullivan nodded, her expression betraying both exhaustion and concern. "You're expecting trouble." "I'm planning for every contingency," Hawkins corrected. Reeves was military before he was a banker. Special forces. He'll have run this scenario in his head, looking for weaknesses. Our job is to ensure he finds none. At 5:45 a.m., Dr. Winters completed his final assessment of Ethan before transfer. "Neurologically stable," he reported. "Vital signs strong. He's cleared for transport." Sarah, who had barely slept, watched as the medical team prepared her son for the journey. Ethan was awake, but quiet, his brief period of clarity from the previous evening having receded into the more familiar fog of confusion. He recognized Sarah and Shadow, but seemed uncertain about the activity surrounding him. "We're moving you to a different hospital," Sarah explained gently. "For perhaps the 3rd time. In Pittsburgh. Better doctors. Better security. Shadow and I will be with you the whole time." Ethan's gaze drifted to the German shepherd, who had maintained his vigilant posture at the foot of the bed throughout the night. "Good," he murmured, the single word containing relief and trust in equal measure. The transport gurney arrived, and with practiced efficiency, the medical team transferred Ethan, securing all monitoring equipment and IV lines. Shadow watched the process with keen attention, moving only when there was space for him alongside the gurney. "The dog rides with us?" the lead paramedic asked, eyeing Shadow dubiously. "The dog stays with Officer Mason," Hawkins confirmed. "Non-negotiable." Final checks complete, the procession moved toward the service elevator, Ethan on the gurney. Sarah walking alongside, Shadow keeping pace, and 4 armed agents creating a protective perimeter. In the adjacent wing, a similar procession accompanied Ryan Mitchell, whose injuries allowed him to be transported in a wheelchair rather than a gurney. The service area had been secured since 3:00 a.m., with agents checking every vehicle, storage closet, and potential hiding place. The transport vehicles waited, engines running to combat the cold, their exhaust creating ghostly plumes in the pre-dawn darkness. Snow continued to fall, limiting visibility and adding an additional challenge to the already complex operation. "Stay alert," Hawkins reminded the team as they prepared to move Ethan from the building to the transport. "This is our most vulnerable point." The loading process proceeded smoothly, the medical team transferring Ethan into the specially equipped vehicle while Shadow, with uncanny discipline, waited for permission to follow. Sarah climbed in next, taking position beside her son, and finally Shadow jumped aboard, immediately positioning himself where he could monitor both Ethan and the vehicle's rear doors. "First transport secure," the team leader reported through the radio. "Proceeding to exit." As the vehicle began to move, following a snowplow that had been clearing the service road since 4:30 a.m., Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Leaving Pinewood Valley meant leaving the center of the conspiracy that had nearly killed her son. But it also meant venturing into open territory where new threats might emerge. The transport followed a carefully planned route, avoiding the main highway in favor of secondary roads where security teams had been positioned at key junctions. The 4-vehicle escort maintained tight formation, 2 SUVs ahead, 2 behind, while a helicopter monitored from above despite the challenging weather conditions. 30 minutes into the journey, as they navigated a particularly isolated stretch of mountain road, Shadow suddenly raised his head, ears alert, body tensing. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Sarah immediately pressed the communication button connecting them to the driver's compartment. "Something's wrong." "Shadow's sensing something." Agent Hawkins, riding in the lead escort vehicle, received the alert instantly. "All units. Possible threat detected. Maintain formation. Increase speed if road conditions allow." Before the convoy could accelerate, however, disaster struck. A massive logging truck appeared around a bend in the road, jackknifing directly into their path. The lead escort vehicle swerved to avoid collision, skidding on the snow-covered pavement and sliding into a drainage ditch. The second escort managed to stop, but the sudden maneuver caused the transport carrying Ethan to brake hard, throwing the medical team off balance. "Ambush!" Hawkins shouted over the radio as gunfire erupted from the tree line. "Defensive positions, protect the transports. Inside the vehicle." Sarah instinctively covered Ethan with her body while Shadow moved to the rear doors, hackles raised, teeth bared in anticipation of threats from that direction. The paramedics scrambled to secure medical equipment that had shifted during the sudden stop, his focus admirably professional despite the chaos unfolding outside. Gunfire exchanged between the FBI escort and hidden assailants created a deadly symphony against the otherwise quiet mountain landscape. Through the vehicle's small windows, Sarah glimpsed agents taking cover behind their vehicles, returning fire toward muzzle flashes barely visible through the falling snow and pre-dawn darkness. "Status of second transport," Hawkins demanded through the radio. "Holding position 1 kilometer back," came the terse reply. "Under fire, but secure." The ambush had been timed and positioned perfectly, a narrow section of road with steep embankments on both sides, limited visibility due to weather, and no immediate access for additional support units. Kenneth Reeves might have left banking for crime, but his military training was evident in the tactical precision of the attack. Inside the transport, The paramedic checked Ethan's vital signs, ensuring that the violent stop hadn't compromised his condition. "He's stable," he reported to Sarah, his voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "But we need to maintain this position. Moving him now could—" His words cut off as the rear doors suddenly rattled. Someone attempting to force them open from outside. Shadow's growl deepened into a snarl, his body coiled and ready as the doors began to give way. In that moment, through the fog of medication and neural injury, Ethan experienced a flash of clarity. "Shadow," he commanded, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Protect," the single command, drilled through countless training sessions, both military and civilian, released Shadow from his temporary restraint. As the doors burst open, revealing a masked figure raising a weapon, the German Shepherd launched forward with explosive force. 85 pounds of muscle and determination, targeting the intruder's arm with precision born of intensive training. The attacker screamed as Shadow's teeth clamped around his wrist, the weapon clattering to the snow-covered ground. A second masked figure appeared, raising his own weapon toward the open doors, but never had the chance to fire. Agent Hawkins, who had circled behind the transport during the firefight, put 2 precise rounds into the man's chest. "Transport compromised," she shouted into her radio. "All units converge on primary transport, inside the vehicle." Sarah had positioned herself between Ethan and the open doors, her mother's instinct to protect overriding all concern for personal safety. The paramedic, showing remarkable courage, had placed himself alongside her, using his body as an additional shield. Shadow maintained his hold on the first attacker, who struggled futilely against the German Shepherd's powerful jaws. As Agent Hawkins approached, weapon trained on the subdued assailant, she recognized him despite the partial mask. "Kenneth Reeves," she said coldly. "You're under arrest." The firefight subsided as quickly as it had begun, the remaining attackers retreating into the forest as FBI reinforcements arrived from both directions along the road. Within minutes, the perimeter was secured, the injured treated, and both transport vehicles declared safe. "New plan," Hawkins announced, holstering her weapon. "Helicopter evacuation from the clearing half a mile ahead. We'll move both transports there under heavy escort." As they prepared to continue, Sarah finally released her protective position over Ethan, tears of relief and residual fear streaking her face. To her astonishment, she found her son fully awake, his eyes clear and focused. "Did we win?" he asked, a ghost of his old humor surfacing despite the gravity of the situation. "We did," she confirmed, squeezing his hand. Shadow made sure of it, as if recognizing he was being discussed. The German Shepherd returned to Ethan's side, having been released from guard duty over the now secured prisoner. Blood matted the fur around his muzzle. Reeves's blood, but his eyes were calm. Mission accomplished. Handler safe. Ethan's hand found the dog's head, fingers gently tangling in the familiar fur. "Good boy," he murmured. "The best boy." The medical team secured the transport once more, and the convoy proceeded to the clearing where a medical evacuation helicopter waited, rotors already turning despite the falling snow. As they transferred Ethan to the aircraft, Sarah marveled at how their journey had transformed from a funeral procession to a fight for survival, from grief to desperate hope. Shadow jumped into the helicopter without prompting, positioning himself beside Ethan's stretcher with the unwavering dedication that had become his hallmark. As the aircraft lifted off, Rising above the snow-covered mountains of Pinewood Valley, Sarah felt a weight lift from her heart. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Ethan's recovery, the legal proceedings against Blackwood's organization, rebuilding their lives, they would face them together, strengthened by bonds that even death itself had failed to sever. In Pittsburgh, a team of neurological specialists waited to begin the long process of healing Ethan's injured brain. The road ahead would be neither short nor easy, but for the first time since that midnight phone call that had shattered her world, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future bright enough to justify all they had endured. As the helicopter banked gently toward the east, the first rays of dawn pierced the snow clouds, illuminating the landscape below with tentative gold. Sarah thought it looked like hope fragile, precious, but undeniably real. In every life, there comes a moment when faith is tested beyond what seems endurable. For those of us who've weathered decades of joys and sorrows, who've seen the world change in ways both wondrous and terrifying, these moments cut deeper because we understand what's truly at stake. Ethan and Shadow's story reminds us of truths we've always known, but sometimes forget that loyalty transcends words, that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance or even death itself. We recognize in Sarah's vigil the same fierce love we feel for our own children. In Ethan's struggle, the battles we've fought to reclaim ourselves after loss. In Shadow's devotion, the companionship that sustains us when all else fails. Their journey speaks to us because we've lived long enough to know that second chances are precious and rare, that healing comes in unexpected forms, and that sometimes, when all human wisdom falls short, it's the silent wisdom of a loyal heart that guides us home. As you listen to their story, remember your own moments of darkness and light, the hands that held yours, the faithful hearts that never abandoned hope. And know that in those connections lies our most profound strength and our truest salvation.